The most painful moment of George Boleyn's life wasn't when the axe fell, but when he stood in court reading aloud the sick charges, accusing him of sleeping with his own sister. Even when ordered to be silent because the details were too filthy, George shouted them out, desperate to show the world just how twisted and fake the trial was. He suffered a social death long before his physical one, branded a monster just to serve a dirty political game. This betrayal was the steep price he paid for being King Henry VIII's best friend. He had been the king's wingman for years, gambling and hunting together, but the moment Henry was done with his sister, George became trash that needed to be taken out. He went from being the king's brother to a convenient scapegoat, sacrificed by his closest pal just to smooth over a divorce. But who was this golden boy of the Tudor court before his inevitable ruin? George entered the world around 1504, born into a family that existed on the razor's edge of English society. On his father's side, the Boleyns were the new men. His father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a man of voracious appetite for advancement. The Boleyns were capable, sharp-witted, and wealthy, but their lineage was rooted in the merchant class, lord mayors and traders. In the snobbish, stratified world of the Tudor aristocracy, the Boleyns smelled of ink and counting houses. They had to be smarter, faster, and harder working than everyone else just to be invited to the table. On his mother's side lay the ancient ironclad prestige of the Howards. Lady Elizabeth Howard was the daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. Her family, represented by the heraldic white lion, had bled for kings for centuries. They were the premier nobility of the realm, dripping with entitlement and military might. George was the fusion of these two warring impulses, the hungry, grasping energy of the Boleyn bull and the aristocratic arrogance of the Howard lion. Born likely at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, a red brick manor that smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, George was the only surviving son. This status placed a crushing weight on his shoulders from the moment he drew breath. In a time when male heirs were the only currency that truly mattered, George was the basket in which Thomas Boleyn placed all his eggs. His sisters, Mary and Anne, were valuable pawns to be married off. George was the future patriarch who would secure the dynasty. Thomas Boleyn was many things, cold, calculating, distant, but he was not a fool. He recognized that the world was changing. The days of the illiterate warrior baron were dying. The court of the young King Henry VIII was not looking for brute strength. It was starving for sophistication. Sir Thomas determined that his son would be the most polished jewel in the English court. George was provided with an education that would have been the envy of a prince. While other noble boys were learning only to joust and hawk, George was immersed in the new learning, humanism. He absorbed knowledge with a terrifying speed. By his early adolescence, George was a linguistic chameleon. He spoke French not just fluently, but with the specific rhythmic cadence of the Parisian court, a skill that would later make him England's most lethal diplomat. He mastered Latin, the universal language of power and church, and gained a working competence in Italian. But it was not just rote learning. George possessed a mind that was nimble, witty, and surprisingly progressive. There is a singular moment from his childhood that illuminates the man he would become. In 1517, barely a teenager, George stood before the royal court during a festive season. The room would have been thick with the scent of roasted meats, wine, and the sweat of hundreds of courtiers. All eyes were on the boy. He did not falter. George delivered a speech in flawless Latin, but it was the subject matter that caused eyebrows to raise. He did not speak on the glory of war or the divine right of kings. He spoke on the necessity of educating women in literature and the liberal arts. It was a radical thesis for the early 16th century. It suggests that George was not merely performing, he was reflecting the reality of his own home. He had grown up with Anne and Mary. He knew intimately that the women of his family possessed intellects that matched or exceeded the men around them. This early respect for female agency would define his life. He would eventually serve a queen not just as a brother, but as a true partner. George was launched into court life while the ink was barely dry on his childhood. He likely began his service as a page, perhaps as young as 10. The court of Henry VIII in the late 1510s and early 1520s was a sensory overload, a perpetual carnival of gold leaf, velvet, music, and machismo. Henry was young, athletic, and golden-haired, a sun-king around whom the entire galaxy revolved. To be near him was to be near the source of all heat and light. To be banished from him was to freeze. George learned the dangerous dance of the courtier quickly. He learned that a raised eyebrow meant disapproval, that a whisper in a corridor could destroy a career, and that friendship was a transactional currency. He watched his father maneuver, bowing and scraping, and he learned. But George had something his father lacked: genuine charisma. Thomas Boleyn was respected. George Boleyn was liked. He was handsome, athletic, and possessed a biting wit that could make a room erupt in laughter. He was a poet in an age that valued verses, a dancer in an age that valued grace, and a gambler in an age that loved risk. His first major moment of public glory came in 1522. The event was the Chateau Vert, an elaborate pageant of courtly love. It was a massive theatrical production involving the highest nobility. The casting was significant. His sister Anne, recently returned from France and dazzling the court with her style, played the allegorical role of perseverance. George was cast as ardent desire. In hindsight, the title is haunting. Ardent desire, burning, consuming, dangerous want. At the time, it was merely a role in a play, but it fit him. George was a young man hungry for life. He was dressed in satin and cloth of gold, dancing before the king, signaling that the Boleyns had arrived. They were no longer the merchant's grandsons. They were the central players in the king's fantasy. Around 1524, the necessities of dynastic ambition clamped down on George's youth. He was married to Jane Parker, the daughter of Lord Morley. History has treated Jane Parker with vitriol, painting her as the villainous, jealous shrew who eventually betrayed George. But in 1524, this was simply a coal business merger. The Boleyns needed to settle land disputes and cement ties with the established nobility. Jane was the bridge. We must pause to consider the reality of this marriage. George was young, brilliant, and likely arrogant. He was a star on the rise. Jane is harder to read, often described as intense and perhaps difficult. They were shoved together by their fathers and told to procreate. The tragedy of George and Jane was silence. There were no children. In a world where a wife's primary duty was to provide heirs and a husband's duty was to beget them, this failure created a vacuum in their marriage that was filled with resentment. While George spent his days bathing in the king's favor and his nights gambling or discussing theology with intellectuals, Jane was left in the margins. The seeds of the bitterness that would one day destroy them both were sown in these early barren years of marriage. By the mid-1520s, George was a fixture of the Privy Chamber. He was a minion, one of the king's close favorites. He played bowls with Henry, lost money to him at cards, and accompanied him on the hunt. But the tectonic plates of history were shifting. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was crumbling. The king needed a son, and Catherine could not give him one. And then Henry's eye fell upon the dark, flashing eyes of Anne Boleyn. This was the turning point. Until this moment, George was a successful courtier. After this moment, he became a soldier in a revolution. Anne refused to be the king's mistress. She demanded to be queen. It was an impossible demand, one that required breaking the laws of God and man, defying the Pope, and rewriting the geopolitical map of Europe. Henry, obsessed and lovesick, turned to the one man he trusted to help him navigate this impossible path, George Boleyn. George ceased to be merely a friend. He became the king's fixer. As Anne's influence grew, she pulled George up with her. But it wasn't nepotism. It was necessity. Anne needed an ally she could trust implicitly, someone who shared her blood and her brain. George became the engine room of the Boleyn faction. While Anne used her allure to captivate the king, George used his intellect to build the legal and diplomatic framework that would make her queen. He began to study the new radical religious texts coming out of Germany, Lutheranism. He realized that the only way for Henry to marry Anne was to reject the Pope's authority entirely. George Boleyn, the court dandy, began to transform into George Boleyn, the religious radical. He was about to step onto the international stage. But George had evolved beyond the frivolity of court pageants. He was no longer just a player in the king's games, but a piece on the chessboard of Europe. As the king's desire for Anne hardened into a geopolitical crisis, George's role shifted from domestic favorite to international weapon. The charm that had captivated the English court was now needed to seduce the kings and scholars of the continent, and he was about to be sent into the lion's den of French diplomacy, where the game was about to become deadly serious. By 1529, the flirtation between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn had hardened into a political siege. The king's great matter, his desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, had stalled. The Pope, Clement VII, was effectively a prisoner of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who happened to be Queen Catherine's nephew. The Pope was never going to grant the divorce. Henry needed a new strategy. If he couldn't get permission from Rome, he would need validation from elsewhere. He needed the support of France, England's traditional enemy turned uneasy ally. He needed the French king, Francis I, to back his claim that his marriage to Catherine was invalid. Enter George Boleyn. At 25 years old, George was thrust onto the center stage of European politics. It is a testament to his brilliance and the king's desperate trust in him that he was chosen for this role. Diplomacy in the 16th century was not merely about delivering messages. It was a high-stakes game of espionage, bribery, flattery, and psychological warfare. Between 1529 and 1535, George undertook 6 separate diplomatic missions to the French court. He was the perfect envoy. He had the French Polish. He could quote French poetry. He knew the intricate etiquette of the Louvre, and he possessed a cynicism that the French courtiers appreciated. But his mission was sordid. George wasn't just negotiating treaties. He was buying souls. In one of his most significant missions, George was tasked with canvassing the great universities of France, the Sorbonne in Paris, the universities of Orléans and Toulouse. Henry needed the theologians of Europe to declare that the Pope was wrong and that the Bible forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow. George traveled with bags of gold. He bribed doctors of divinity, threatened dissenters, and charmed deans. He wrote home to Henry, meticulously detailing how he had gained the opinions of the scholars. It was George Boleyn who helped manufacture the intellectual consensus that allowed Henry to eventually break with Rome. He was the salesman of the Reformation. However, George was undergoing a transformation that went far deeper than political maneuvering. While in France, moving through the shadows of the diplomatic world, George made contact with something dangerous, the radical fringe of the Reformation. History often dismisses the Boleyns as purely ambitious, caring only for power. This view is incomplete. George and Anne were true believers. They were evangelicals, early proponents of what would become Protestantism. They believed that the Catholic Church was corrupt, bloated, and idolatrous. They believed in the concept of sola scriptura, that the Bible should be the sole authority for Christians, and that it should be available in English, not hidden away in Latin. George used his position as an ambassador to commit acts of high treason against the Catholic Church. As a diplomat, George had immunity. His luggage could not be searched by customs officers. He used this privilege to become a high-level smuggler. When returning from France, his diplomatic pouches were often stuffed not just with treaties, but with banned heretical books. He brought in the works of William Tyndale and French reformers like Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples. These were books that could get a common man burned at the stake for possessing. George brought them directly into the heart of the English court. He didn't just read them, he weaponized them. There is a famous account of George and Anne collaborating to turn the king's mind. George obtained a copy of Tyndale's The Obedience of a Christian Man. He marked specific passages that argued that kings were accountable only to God, not to the Pope. He gave the book to Anne, who in turn brought it to Henry, famously saying, "This is a book for all kings to read." George was the intellectual conduit. He was the one debating the bishops, using his humanist education to tear apart their arguments. In this period, we see George not as a pawn, but as a pioneer, a young man genuinely convinced he was saving the soul of England, even as he destroyed its church. To rise, the Boleyns had to clear the board. The great obstacle in their path was Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the butcher's son, who had ruled England as Henry's right hand for decades. Wolsey had failed to get the divorce, and the Boleyns smelled blood. George played a critical role in the cardinal's destruction. The Boleyn faction, led by George, his father Thomas, and the Duke of Norfolk, waged a relentless whispering campaign against Wolsey. They intercepted his letters. They poisoned the king's ear with stories of Wolsey's duplicity. When Wolsey finally fell in 1529, stripped of his power and his wealth, it was the Boleyn era that dawned. The spoils of war were distributed, and George was a primary beneficiary. In December 1529, at the Grand Christmas Courts, George was knighted and summoned to Parliament. More importantly, he was granted the courtesy title by which he is best known to history, Viscount Rochford. This was more than a name change. It was an elevation into the peerage. George now walked the halls of power, not just as the king's friend, but as a lord of the realm. He was given grants of land, positions of influence, and a steady stream of income. He was 25 years old, a viscount, a diplomat, and the brother of the woman who held the king's heart in her hand. The world was his oyster. The climax of George's diplomatic efforts came in October 1532. The stage was set for a massive summit between Henry VIII and Francis I at Calais. The goal was to get Francis to publicly accept Anne Boleyn as England's future queen. George was the master of ceremonies for this event. He arrived early to prepare the lodgings, ensuring that the visual display of wealth and power would be overwhelming. It was during this trip that the final barrier was broken. With the tacit support of the French king secured, Henry and Anne finally slept together. They had waited 6 years. But now, with the political groundwork laid by George, they felt safe. By January 1533, Anne was pregnant. The clock began to tick. They had to be married before the pregnancy became visible. A bastard child would be useless. George's urgency increased. He pushed for the final break with Rome. On January 25th, 1533, in a secret ceremony at Whitehall Palace, Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn. George was almost certainly one of the handful of witnesses. It was the victory they had fought for, bled for, and sinned for. The year 1533 was the zenith of George Boleyn's life. In May, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. Anne was declared the true wife. On June 1st, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England. It was a spectacle of unparalleled magnificence. And riding at the very front of the procession, leading the nobility of England, was George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. He looked around and saw a world he had helped create. His sister wore the crown of St. Edward. His father was the Earl of Wiltshire. He was the brother-in-law of the king. In September, Anne gave birth. It was not the son they had prayed for, but a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed, but not devastated. He was strong. Anne was fertile. Surely a boy would follow. In the aftermath of the birth, George's power consolidated further. In 1534, he was appointed Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports. This was a massive promotion. The Cinque Ports were the gateway to the kingdom. As Lord Warden, George commanded the navy in that sector, controlled the courts of the region, and managed the country's defenses against invasion. He was now a military commander as well as a diplomat. He took up residence at Dover Castle, the key to England. But absolute power corrupts and it hardens. As the Boleyns cemented their hold, the regime became darker. The English people were not happy about the break with Rome or the casting aside of the popular Queen Catherine. The pulpits were full of priests preaching against the concubine. The Boleyns had to crush the opposition, and George became the enforcer. In 1535, the government demanded that all men swear the oath of succession, acknowledging Anne as the lawful queen and her children as heirs. To refuse was treason. Two giants of the age refused: Sir Thomas More, the former chancellor and humanist scholar, and Bishop John Fisher. George Boleyn sat on the commission that interrogated and condemned these men. There is a chilling record of George visiting the Carthusian monks, an order of silent, holy men who refused the oath, in the Tower of London. George, the humanist poet, lectured them on theology, trying to bully them into submission. When they refused, he abandoned them to their fate. The Carthusians were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Thomas More and John Fisher were beheaded. George was no longer just the charming youth playing ardent desire. He was a man with blood on his hands. He had chosen his side, and he was willing to kill to protect it. He believed he was doing God's work by protecting the Reformation, but to the old nobility and the Catholics of Europe, he was a monster. He and Anne were riding a tiger. They had to keep moving, keep feeding the beast, because to stop meant to be eaten. They needed a son. And as 1535 turned to 1536, the tension in the court was palpable. A bowstring pulled almost to the snapping point. The Boleyns had conquered the church and the state, but they had not yet conquered the king's need for a son or the people's love. As the calendar turned to 1536, the year that would define their legacy, the fates seemed to align for a final showdown. The death they had longed for, that of the old Queen Catherine, was approaching, but her passing would bring with it a strange and terrible curse that stripped away their last layer of protection. And the tiger began to look at them with hungry eyes. If 1533 was the summer of Boleyn glory, 1536 was the winter of their discontent. The year opened with a sequence of events so dramatic they feel scripted by a tragedian. On January 7th, 1536, Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbolton Castle. When the news reached the court, Henry and Anne wore yellow, a color that in England signified joy, but in Spain signified mourning. They celebrated. They believed their greatest threat was gone. As long as Catherine lived, Anne was the usurper in the eyes of Europe. With Catherine dead, Anne was the sole undisputed queen. But they had miscalculated. Catherine's existence had actually been Anne's shield. As long as Catherine was alive, Henry could not discard Anne without tacitly admitting he should go back to Catherine. With Catherine dead, the path was clear. If Henry rid himself of Anne now, he would be a bachelor, free to marry anyone he chose without any legal baggage. And Henry was looking. His eyes had settled on Jane Seymour, a woman who was the antithesis of Anne, pale, quiet, submissive, and seemingly devoid of the sharp wit that now exhausted the king. The atmosphere at court was brittle, but the Boleyns still had one card left to play. Anne was pregnant again. This child was their salvation. George knew that if his sister produced a son, the grumbling of the people and the plotting of the nobles would vanish instantly. A Prince of Wales cured all ills. But on January 24th, disaster struck. Henry VIII, now 44 but still desperate to prove his vitality, was jousting at Greenwich. George was likely there, watching as the king thundered down the list in full armor. Suddenly the king's horse stumbled and fell. The massive armored beast rolled over the king. For 2 terrifying hours, the ruler of England lay unconscious. Panic tore through the court. George must have felt the ground shaking beneath him. If Henry died, the Boleyns were finished. They would be at the mercy of the Princess Mary's supporters. Henry survived, but he was changed. Many modern historians and medical experts suspect this accident caused a traumatic brain injury that permanently altered his personality, transforming him from a difficult narcissist into a paranoid tyrant. 5 days later, on the day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral, the stress took its toll on Anne. She went into premature labor. The child was a boy. He was born dead. The scene in Anne's chamber was one of biblical despair. When Henry entered, he did not offer comfort. He looked at the dead son who would have secured his dynasty and uttered the chilling words, "I see that God will not give me male children." He turned on his heel and walked out. It was the death knell of the marriage. To Henry's superstitious mind, this was divine judgment. His marriage to Anne was a curse, just as his marriage to Catherine had been. He had been seduced by witchcraft, he reasoned. He had been tricked. George Boleyn was a master of political survival, but he was now facing a predator he could not outmaneuver. Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell, the blacksmith's son turned chief minister, had been the Boleyns' greatest ally. Together they had broken the power of the church. But Cromwell was a pragmatist who valued his own neck above all else. He saw the king's mood shifting. He saw that Henry wanted out. Cromwell knew that if he didn't facilitate the king's desire to be rid of Anne, the king would turn on him. Furthermore, Cromwell and the Boleyns had begun to clash over policy. The Boleyns wanted the money from the dissolved monasteries to go to education and charity. Cromwell wanted it for the king's treasury. They had become liabilities. In April 1536, Cromwell made his choice. He would not just help Henry divorce Anne, he would surgically remove the entire Boleyn faction from the face of the earth. But how? A simple divorce was messy. It left Anne alive as a focus for rebellion. Cromwell needed a final solution. He needed treason. Cromwell began to gather evidence. He turned the Queen's household into a panopticon of spies. He interrogated ladies-in-waiting, seeking any hint of flirtation, any loose word that could be twisted. It was during this dragnet that the name of George Boleyn was snagged. To destroy a queen, you must destroy her reputation. Cromwell began to construct a case of adultery. He targeted men who were close to Anne, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and the musician Mark Smeaton. But Cromwell needed something more. He needed a crime so heinous, so repulsively unnatural, that it would shock the king into a blind rage and make any defense impossible. He looked at the close, intense relationship between George and Anne. He looked at their shared intellect, their private conversations, their long history of us against the world, and he twisted it. He concocted the charge of incest. This was a stroke of evil genius. Incest was a crime against God and nature. It confirmed Henry's suspicion that Anne was a witch or a monster. It explained why the male children had died. God was punishing the abomination. George's wife, Jane Rochford, becomes the critical pivot here. Cromwell needed a witness from inside the family. Jane was interrogated. We do not know exactly what she said, but the indictment records suggest she confirmed an undue familiarity. Did she say they were lovers? Or did she merely say that George spent long hours in Anne's room? Cromwell was a master at taking a grain of sand and spinning it into a mountain of treason. George Boleyn remained dangerously unaware of the axe hanging over his head. The Boleyns knew they were in trouble, but they thought it was political trouble, not a death sentence. On May 1st, 1536, the king and queen attended the May Day joust at Greenwich. George was one of the challengers. He rode out in his finery, the consummate courtier, breaking lances and receiving applause, but the king was agitated. Midway through the joust, Henry received a message, likely from Cromwell, informing him that the musician Mark Smeaton had confessed to sleeping with the queen. Henry abruptly stood up. He did not speak to Anne. He did not say goodbye. He mounted his horse and rode away with a small retinue, leaving the queen alone in the royal box, confused and terrified. George must have watched the king ride off with a sinking heart. The sun had just gone behind a cloud, and the temperature was dropping fast. The next morning, May 2nd, the blow fell. Mark Smeaton and Henry Norris were already in custody. At Greenwich, Anne was arrested while watching a tennis match. She was informed she was being taken to the Tower of London. George was at Whitehall Palace. He was not given the dignity of a warning. The guards came for him. He was arrested and escorted to the Tower. The journey by barge down the Thames must have been surreal. He passed the palaces where he had feasted, the riverside houses of friends who would no longer know him. He traveled under the Traitor's Gate, the water entrance to the tower from which few returned. It was only then, perhaps within the cold stone walls of the fortress, that he learned the full extent of the charges. He was not just accused of treason, he was accused of sleeping with his sister. The shock must have been physical. George was a religious man, a reformer. The accusation was not just a threat to his life, it was an assault on his soul. It was a filthy lie designed to strip him of his humanity before they stripped him of his head. As the door of his cell clanged shut, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, was gone. In his place sat a prisoner, alone in the dark. May 1536 in the Tower of London was a claustrophobic nightmare. George was not alone in his fall. Cromwell's net had dragged in 4 others: Henry Norris, the king's closest personal servant, Sir Francis Weston, a young and foolish favorite, William Brereton, a powerful magnate from the Welsh marches, and Mark Smeaton, the low-born musician. Smeaton was the weak link. Under torture, likely the rack or the rope, he had confessed. The others, noblemen all, staunchly maintained their innocence, but their denials meant nothing. They were tried on May 12th. The jury, handpicked for compliance, found them guilty within minutes. They were condemned to die. George, however, was a peer of the realm. By ancient right, he could not be tried by a common jury. He had to be tried by his equals, the lords of England. This granted him a separate trial, a piece of political theater that the king and Cromwell could not fully control. George spent his days in the Tower preparing. He knew the evidence against him was non-existent. There were no witnesses to incest because it had never happened. There were no letters, no caught whispers. There was only the confession of a tortured musician and the ambiguous testimony of his own wife. He must have felt a flicker of hope. If he could speak, if he could use that silver tongue that had charmed the French court and argued theology with bishops, perhaps he could shame his peers into acquitting him. The date was set, May 15th, 1536. The venue was the Great Hall of the Tower of London. The atmosphere was electric. This was the celebrity trial of the century. Over 2,000 spectators crammed into the hall, ambassadors, merchants, courtiers, and commoners, all desperate to catch a glimpse of the fallen favorite. The stage management was brutal. Presiding over the trial as Lord High Steward was the Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard. He was George's own uncle, the brother of George's mother. But family meant nothing in the Tudor game of survival. Norfolk was a political animal who sensed the wind changing. He was there to ensure his nephew died, so the Howard name could survive the Boleyn wreck. George was led in. He was dressed not in the rags of a prisoner, but with the dignity of a viscount. He stood at the bar, alone. There was no defense counsel in Tudor treason trials. The accused had to defend himself against the best legal minds of the crown. What followed was extraordinary. The Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, a man who hated the Boleyns and had spent years plotting their downfall, wrote a report that serves as our primary window into the room. Even he, an enemy, was awestruck by George's performance. George was accused of incest, of conspiring to kill the king, and of mocking the king's person. He did not beg. He did not weep. He went to war. As the prosecutors read out the charges, George dismantled them one by one. He answered with such clarity, such wit, and such obvious command of the facts that the mood in the room began to shift. He pointed out the lack of dates, the lack of witnesses, and the absurdity of the claims. The crowd, sensing the weakness of the crown's case, began to murmur. The impossible seemed to be happening. George was winning. Chapuis reported that the betting in the hall started to swing wildly. Men were laying wagers of 10-1 that George would be acquitted. In a rigged court, under the glare of a tyrant king, George Boleyn was arguing his way to freedom. Cromwell and the prosecutors, seeing their case teetering, played their trump card. They needed to rattle George, to force him into a mistake, or simply to humiliate him so deeply that his defense would crumble. They handed George a folded piece of paper. The contents of this note were explosive. It contained an allegation that George and Anne had discussed the king's sexual inadequacies, specifically that Henry had no vigor and no virtue with women. In the hyper-masculine world of Henry VIII, implying the king was impotent was not just an insult, it was treason. It struck at the very legitimacy of the succession. The prosecutor instructed George to read the note silently to himself, and then simply answer yes or no as to whether he had discussed such things. This was the trap. If George read it silently and said no, they would produce witnesses to contradict him. If he said yes, he admitted to mocking the king. George took the paper. He looked at the judges. He looked at his uncle Norfolk. He looked at the crowd of 2,000 people who were hanging on his every move. He made a split-second decision that historians have debated for 500 years. George did not read it silently. He raised his head, and in a booming voice that reached the rafters, he read the allegations aloud. That the king has no vigor. That the king has no virtue. The hall gasped. He had just broadcast the king's most shameful secret to the world. Why did he do it? Some argue it was a blunder, but George was too smart for that. It was almost certainly a calculated act of suicide by judge. George realized in that moment that he would never leave the tower alive. The verdict was preordained. If he was going to die, he was not going to die quietly. He used his last public moment to strike a blow against the king who was murdering him. He shamed Henry in front of his subjects. It was an act of supreme reckless courage. It was the ardent desire of his youth turning into a blaze of defiance. The outburst sealed his fate, but it also saved his dignity. He had not cowered. After the reading of the note, the trial rushed to its inevitable conclusion. The peers of the realm, 26 of them, retired to consider their verdict. When they returned, they were asked one by one for their decision. One by one they answered, guilty. Even his uncle Norfolk condemned him. The sentence for treason was mandatory and barbaric. To be hanged, cut down while still alive, castrated, disemboweled, and then quartered. George stood to hear the sentence. He asked for only one thing, that his debts be paid out of his seized assets, so that no man would suffer financial loss because of him. It was the request of a gentleman. He was led away from the bar, the axe of the guard now turned toward him, signaling his condemnation. Back in his cell, the adrenaline of the trial faded, replaced by the cold reality of death. However, the king granted one final mercy. Because of his high rank, the sentence was commuted. There would be no hanging or drawing. George would be beheaded. He had 2 days left to live. In the 16th century, a good death was essential. It was the final performance of a nobleman's life. You had to make your peace with God, forgive your executioner, and acknowledge the king's justice to protect your family's remaining property. George turned to his faith. The religious books he had once smuggled now became his only comfort. He spent his final hours in prayer. He did not write to the king to beg for his life. He knew Henry was deaf to him. On the morning of May 17th, the lieutenant from the Tower of London arrived at his cell. The moment had come. George awoke, donned his black velvet cloak, and prepared to walk the short distance to Tower Hill. That morning broke gray and cool over London. The air around Tower Hill was thick with the murmurs of a massive crowd. Executions were a dark form of entertainment for the Tudor people, and the beheading of a viscount, the Queen's brother, had drawn thousands. They crowded into any available space, clinging to windows and climbing onto the roof for a better view of the execution platform, which had been erected specifically for this perilous massacre. Inside the tower, the 5 condemned men were gathered: George Boleyn, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and Mark Smeaton. The hierarchy of the court applied even in death. As the highest-ranking peer, George was granted the privilege of dying first. He would not have to watch his friends die, they would have to watch him. The gates opened. George walked out. He did not struggle. The accounts describe him as composed, his face pale but his steps steady. He was walking out of history and into legend, and he seemed determined to make the transition with the grace that had defined his life. When he mounted the scaffold, George looked out at the sea of faces. In the front rows, he likely saw courtiers he had feasted with, men who had laughed at his jokes and sought his patronage just weeks before. Now they were there to see his blood. Tudor execution speeches were a rigid genre. You were expected to follow a script. Acknowledge you were a sinner. Say the king was a good and just ruler, and ask the crowd to pray for you. If you deviated, if you claimed innocence too loudly, the executioner could make your death messy, or the king could retaliate against your widow and parents. George played the game, but he infused it with a profound melancholic subtext. He did not admit to the incest. He did not admit to treason. Christian men, he began, his voice carrying over the silence of the crowd, I am born under the law and judged under the law and die under the law, and the law has condemned me. It was a masterclass in ambiguity. He was admitting that the legal process had found him guilty, not that he was guilty in truth. He continued, turning his speech into a sermon on the fragility of power. Trust not in the vanity of the world, and in the flatteries of the court and the favor of kings. For if I had followed God's law as I have the king's, I should not be here. This was the dagger. He was telling the crowd that his devotion to Henry VIII, the man he had served, entertained, and loved as a friend, had been his undoing. He was warning every ambitious young man in the audience that the favor of a tyrant is a death trap. He asked for forgiveness from any he had wronged. He forgave his judges. And then he knelt. George removed his fine velvet gown. He unbuttoned his collar. The executioner knelt and asked for forgiveness, which George granted. He knelt at the block. Unlike the French style, where a prisoner knelt upright and was struck with a sword, George faced the English axe. He had to lay his head down on the wood. He began to pray aloud, "Lord God, have pity on my soul." He repeated it over and over. The crowd held its breath. The executioner raised the heavy axe. With one swing, the ardent desire was extinguished. George Boleyn was 32 years old. The executioner lifted the head to the crowd. The body was quickly bundled away. There was no coffin ready, another final indignity. His remains, along with his head, were gathered up and carried just a few hundred yards to the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, a small church within the tower walls. There, under the flagstones of the chancel, the most brilliant young man of the English Renaissance was buried in an unmarked grave. George was gone, but the horror was not over. One by one, the other men mounted the scaffold. Henry Norris, the king's old friend, William Brereton, the rugged soldier, Francis Weston, who was only 25 and had written a heartbreaking letter to his parents, begging for forgiveness for his debts, and finally Mark Smeaton, the musician who had confessed. Because he was common-born, he was not beheaded. He was looked down upon even in death. However, in a rare act of mercy, the king had commuted his sentence from hanging and quartering to beheading as well. Smeaton died last. Did he regret the confession that had doomed them all? Did he look at the blood-soaked straw where George had knelt and realize the enormity of the lie? We will never know. The axe fell, and the silence returned to Tower Hill. From her apartments in the Queen's Tower, Anne Boleyn would have heard the roar of the crowd. She might have heard the boom of the cannon that signaled the executions were finished. She knew. The bond between George and Anne had been the defining relationship of their lives. They were two halves of the same soul, ambitious, intellectual, arrogant, and devout. Losing George was like losing a limb. When she was told he was dead, her reaction was a mix of grief and a strange manic resilience. She reportedly said she was glad he was out of pain. She knew her turn was coming. The death of the men removed the last hurdle. If the lovers were dead, the adulteress must follow. On May 19th, 2 days after George, Anne was led out to a scaffold built on the Tower Green. She was granted the mercy of a swordsman from Calais, who took her head with a single lightning-fast stroke. Her body was carried to the same chapel, St. Peter at Vincula. The stones were lifted again. She was buried just feet away from George. They had risen together from the Norfolk countryside to the pinnacle of the world. They had changed the religion of a nation. They had defied a pope and an emperor. And now they lay together in the dark. Two traitors, crowded into a hole under a chapel floor. With the earth tamped down over their graves, the Boleyn era was seemingly erased. Their father, Thomas Boleyn, survived. He is often vilified for not fighting for his children. But what could he do? To speak out was to die. He retreated to Hever Castle, a broken man, and died 2 years later. Their mother, Elizabeth Howard, died only a year after her children. The light had gone out of the family. Jane Rochford, George's widow, survived. She remained at court serving the new queen, Jane Seymour. She had secured her life by testifying against her husband, but she carried a heavy burden. History would come for her too in time. For Henry VIII, the slate was clean. On May 30th, just 11 days after Anne's execution, he married Jane Seymour. The court wore white. The Boleyns were never mentioned again. Their names were chiseled off walls. Their badges were painted over. It was a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. But you cannot kill a legacy with an axe. George and Anne had left behind a delayed action bomb in the nursery of the royal palace. A red-headed toddler named Elizabeth. She had George's eyes and Anne's brain. With George dead and buried under the chapel floor, one figure remained standing in the wreckage of the Boleyn dynasty. His widow, Jane Rochford. History has painted Jane as the architect of her husband's destruction, the wicked wife who whispered lies to Cromwell. Whether she was malicious or merely a terrified pawn squeezed by the king's men, her survival came at a terrible cost. She kept her head, but she lost her reputation and her financial security. George's assets were seized by the crown, leaving her to beg Cromwell for a pension. She was a pariah, the woman who had testified against her own husband. Yet, in a twist of irony that would make a dramatist blush, Jane Rochford remained at court. She served the next queen, Jane Seymour. She served Anne of Cleves, and then she served the young, reckless Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, and a first cousin of George and Anne Boleyn. It was here that the ghosts of 1536 came back to haunt her. Jane, who had helped condemn George for sexual deviancy, found herself acting as the go-between for Queen Catherine Howard's actual illicit affair with Thomas Culpeper. She arranged the meetings. She stood guard at the doors. When the affair was discovered in 1541, the king's wrath was apocalyptic. Jane Rochford was arrested and taken to the Tower, the same prison where her husband had spent his final days. Under questioning, she crumbled. She went insane with fear, to the point where the law had to be changed to allow the execution of the insane. On February 13th, 1542, Jane Rochford was beheaded on the Tower Green, on the exact same spot where her sister-in-law Anne had died 6 years earlier. Before she died, she reportedly admitted that her testimony against George had been false, confessing, "God has permitted me to suffer this shameful death as punishment for having contributed to my husband's death. I falsely accused him of loving, in an incestuous manner, his sister, Anne Boleyn. For this, I deserve to die." With her death, the loop was closed. The accuser had followed the accused into the dark. For years, the name Boleyn was whispered only as a cautionary tale. Henry VIII did his best to scrub George and Anne from history. He destroyed their portraits, painted over their crests, and melted down their silverware. But he could not destroy biology. In the royal nursery grew the daughter of the witch. Elizabeth was a Boleyn down to her fingertips. She had her father's red hair, but she had her mother's black eyes and the sharp, dangerous intellect of her uncle George. When Elizabeth I ascended the throne in 1558, the vindication of George Boleyn truly began. She did not speak of her mother and uncle often. It was too politically dangerous, but she honored them in quiet, powerful ways. She promoted their surviving relatives, the Careys. She surrounded herself with the sons of the men who had been loyal to the Boleyn faction. There is a poignant artifact that survived the centuries, the Chequers ring. When Elizabeth died in 1603, a ring was taken from her finger. It contained a secret mechanism. When opened, it revealed 2 tiny portraits hidden inside. One was of herself. The other was of her mother, Anne Boleyn. For 45 years, the greatest monarch in English history had worn her traitor mother's face on her hand. It is not a stretch to imagine that she also carried the memory of the brilliant uncle who had helped put her mother on the throne. We must also remember George Boleyn, not just as a politician, but as an artist. In the 1530s, the English court was experiencing a cultural flowering, and George was one of its gardeners. He was a noted poet, writing in the new, emotive style introduced by Thomas Wyatt. Tragically, because of his disgrace, almost all of his work was destroyed. Manuscripts bearing the name Rochford were burned or lost. However, we have glimpses. He was known to have translated French religious texts and written psalms. There is a poem often attributed to him, supposedly written in the Tower before his death, titled, "O Death Rock Me Asleep." While authorship is debated, the melancholic, resigned tone fits the man who stood in the window of the tower, watching the preparations for his own end. "O death, rock me asleep, bring me on quiet rest. Let pass my weary, guiltless ghost out of my careful breast." If he did write it, it reveals a man who was ready to leave the shark tank behind, exhausted by the brutal game of survival. While George Boleyn lay in his unmarked grave, the shock waves of his death were only just beginning to ripple outward. To understand the immediate cultural impact of his execution, we must look through the eyes of the man who watched it happen, Sir Thomas Wyatt. Wyatt was the premier poet of the age, a former lover of Anne Boleyn, and a close friend of George. He had been arrested along with the others, but through the intervention of his powerful family and Thomas Cromwell, he was spared. Imprisoned in the bell tower of the fortress, Wyatt had a direct line of sight to the scaffold on Tower Hill. Through the narrow barred window of his cell, he witnessed the execution of George and the other 4 men. The trauma of that morning birthed one of the most haunting poems of the Tudor era, Innocentia veritas viat, fides circumdederunt me. In his verses, Wyatt serves as the first historian of the tragedy, recording not just the event, but the character of the men who died. He wrote of George specifically, lamenting the fall of such a brilliant mind. He noted that George's great wit and eloquence could not save him from the monkey. Wyatt's survival was a heavy burden. He knew he was alive only by chance. His poetry cemented the idea among the intelligentsia that George was not a traitor, but a martyr to the capriciousness of fortune. George Boleyn had been a fixture on the international stage. When the news of his execution reached the courts of Europe, it was met not with acceptance, but with stunned disbelief and cynicism. In Paris, King Francis I, who had known George well and hosted him many times, was incredulous. He reportedly told the English ambassador that he could not believe the charges of incest. The French court, which was accustomed to scandal, found the accusation against the Boleyn siblings too monstrous to be credible. They viewed it for what it was, a crude political hatchet job. In the Holy Roman Empire, the reaction was cooler but equally pragmatic. The imperial ambassador Chapuis, who had hated the Boleyns, did not celebrate George's death as justice for a crime. Instead, he reported it as a necessary political purging. To Europe, George's death confirmed that Henry VIII had become a tyrant who devoured his own creations. The reputation of English justice was shattered. George's trial was cited as proof that in England, the king's will was the only law that mattered. One of the most critical yet often overlooked figures in the Boleyn saga is Matthew Parker. Parker was a brilliant scholar and a chaplain to Anne Boleyn. He was deeply embedded in the intellectual circle that George and Anne had cultivated. Shortly before her arrest, Anne had given a charge to Parker, a solemn request to look after her daughter, Elizabeth, if anything should happen to her. After the executions of 1536, Parker went into a quiet internal exile. He survived the dangerous final years of Henry VIII and the chaotic reign of Mary I by keeping his head down. But he never forgot the Boleyns. He preserved their books. He remembered their theology. When Elizabeth I finally took the throne in 1558, she summoned Matthew Parker. She made him her first Archbishop of Canterbury. This is the hidden legacy of George Boleyn. The religious structure of the Elizabethan Church, the middle way that defines Anglicanism to this day, was built by the man who had been the spiritual brother of George and Anne. Every time Parker defended the English Bible or the independence of the English crown, he was channeling the arguments George Boleyn had made in the 1530s. The Boleyn bodies were gone, but their mind was now ruling the Church of England. We must also spare a moment for the most tragic figure of the aftermath, Sir Thomas Boleyn, the Earl of Wiltshire. History has often cast Thomas as the ultimate villain, the cold father who sacrificed his children for ambition, and then did nothing to save them. But the records from 1536 to his death in 1538 tell a sadder story. Thomas was a crushed man. Following the executions, he was stripped of his influential office as Lord Privy Seal. He was forced to lend the king money which he knew would never be repaid. He retreated to Hever Castle, the childhood home where he had raised the children who were now headless in the Tower. There is a pathetic letter from this period in which Thomas writes to Cromwell, thanking him for being good lord to him. It reads like the letter of a hostage thanking his captor. He knew that if he showed even a flicker of anger or grief, the king would come for him next. He had to swallow the murder of his son and daughter and continue to bow to their killer. He died in March 1538. He is buried in St. Peter's Church at Hever. On his magnificent brass tomb, he is depicted in full Knights of the Garter regalia. But significantly, there is no mention of his children on the tomb. The silence of the stone reflects the silence he was forced to endure in life. Why did the lie of incest stick so effectively in 1536? It worked because it exploited the specific cultural anxieties of the time. The Boleyns were always seen as too close. They were a tight-knit faction that excluded outsiders. George and Anne spoke French together. They shared inside jokes. They influenced the king as a unit. To the jealous outsiders, this closeness was impenetrable and threatening. Cromwell simply took that known closeness and sexualized it. He perverted a sibling bond into a crime against nature. Furthermore, the legal system of 1536 was designed to find guilt. The presumption of innocence did not exist in treason trials. The burden of proof was on the accused. George had to prove he didn't do it, against a prosecutor who didn't have to prove he did. Once the king decided George was guilty, the trial was merely a bureaucratic ritual to validate the king's desire. George Boleyn fell not because of what he did, but because of what he represented, a power block that rivaled the king. In a tyranny, there is only room for one ego. George's brilliance, once his greatest asset, became his death warrant because it made him too dangerous. To truly understand the brilliance of George Boleyn, we must look at the ink he left behind before the blood was spilled. While his body lies under the flagstones of the Tower, a piece of his soul survives in a battered leather-bound book held today in the British Library, the Devonshire Manuscript. This manuscript is one of the most significant artifacts of the Tudor court. It was not a formal book, but a circulating anthology, a social media feed of the 1530s. It was passed from hand to hand among the ladies and gentlemen of Anne Boleyn's circle. They wrote poems in it, copied verses they liked, and scribbled margins with secret messages and initials. George was a central figure in this literary underground. Along with his friend Thomas Wyatt and the Earl of Surrey, George was pioneering a new form of English poetry. They were adapting the Italian sonnet for the English ear. While Thomas Wyatt is remembered as the father of English poetry because his family survived to publish his works, George's voice was deliberately silenced. Most of his papers were seized and burned upon his arrest. However, scholars believe several anonymous poems in the Devonshire manuscript are George's work. They reveal a mind that was cynical, melancholy, and deeply attuned to the precarious nature of court life. The verses speak of broken faith, of fortune's wheel, and the pain of loving in a place where love was a commodity. In these pages, George is not the arrogant politician. He is the sensitive artist, pouring his anxiety onto the page. This poetry was not just a hobby. It was a lethal weapon. The Tudor court operated on the code of courtly love. In this game, a man was expected to declare his undying, suffering love for a mistress. The woman was expected to be cold and distant. It was a role-playing exercise, a way to channel sexual tension into art. George was a master of this game. He played the role of the suffering lover to perfection in the pageants and masks. However, Thomas Cromwell weaponized this artistic convention. In the trials of 1536, the playful, hyperbolic language of courtly love was twisted into evidence of adultery. When George or the other men wrote poems about dying for love of the queen, they meant it metaphorically, as a feudal subject loves their sovereign. Cromwell argued they meant it physically. George Boleyn's tragedy was partly linguistic. He was a man speaking the language of the Renaissance, nuanced, metaphorical, ironic, trapped in a trial run by men speaking the language of brutal literalism. He died because his poetry was read as a confession. George's intellectual legacy extends beyond poetry into the very fabric of English religion. We have touched on his smuggling of books, but his role went deeper. He was a patron. In the 16th century, scholars and translators could not survive without a wealthy sponsor to pay for their food, their paper, and their printing costs. George Boleyn became the primary financial backer for the evangelical movement in London. He was the dedicatee of several major religious works. Simon Fish, the radical author of A Supplication for the Beggars, was protected by the Boleyns. There is a specific translation of the Psalms from 1534 dedicated to George with the desire that the nobility may be brought to the knowledge of God. This dedication is telling. The Reformers saw George not just as a wallet, but as a role model, the ideal Christian knight who could influence other young nobles to abandon the superstitions of Rome. It is a bitter irony that the man who helped fund the translation of the Bible into English, the book that would become the foundation of English identity, was executed as a godless sinner. After May 17, 1536, a silence fell. The king's libraries were purged. Any book bearing George's signature or dedication was liable to be destroyed or defaced. It was an attempt to lobotomize the culture of the court, to remove the Boleyn influence from the intellectual record. Unlike his sister Anne, who became a martyr figure for the Protestant church under Elizabeth I, George was left in the gray zone. The nature of the accusations, incest, made him too hot to handle for Victorian historians. Even as Anne's reputation was rehabilitated in the 19th century as the tragic mother of the Reformation, George remained the unspeakable brother. It is only in the last few decades, with historians re-examining the primary sources and the Devonshire manuscript, that George has re-emerged. We are finally seeing him not as a sexual predator, but as a Renaissance man in the truest sense. a soldier, a scholar, a poet, and a politician who lived fast and died young. There is one final haunting detail to the Boleyn saga. George Boleyn died without a legitimate heir. His marriage to Jane Rochford was barren. With his death, the direct male line of the Boleyns was extinguished. However, rumors have persisted for centuries of an illegitimate son. George was a man of his time, and the court was a promiscuous place. Some genealogists have attempted to trace a line of George Boleyns appearing in Ireland or rural England in the late 1500s, claiming descent from the lost Viscount. Most historians dismiss this as wishful thinking, but the desire to find a son for George speaks to our collective wish for a different ending. We want the brilliant young man to have left something behind other than a headless corpse, but perhaps his true heir was not a son. His heir was the age he helped create. The Elizabethan Golden Age, an era of poetry, exploration, and religious independence, was the flowering of the seeds George and Anne planted in the rocky soil of the 1530s. When Shakespeare wrote his sonnets 60 years later, he was walking on a path that George Boleyn had helped cut through the wilderness. When Francis Drake sailed against the Spanish Armada, he was defending the independent nation George Boleyn had helped define. A factual analysis of the Baga de Secretis shows that the case against George Boleyn falls apart completely. The indictment accused George and Anne of specific acts of incest on specific dates. In the 16th century, prosecutors often fabricated dates to make charges look official, but in their haste to destroy the Boleyns, Cromwell's men were sloppy. The indictment claimed that the first act of incest occurred on October 6, 1533, at Westminster. A simple check of the royal itinerary reveals the lie. On that date, the court was not at Westminster. Anne was still in confinement at Greenwich following the birth of Elizabeth. George was likely elsewhere attending to his duties. Another charge claimed an offense on Christmas Day, 1535. Records show that on this day, Anne was bedridden, suffering from a miscarriage scare or illness, and surrounded by her ladies. The idea that she could sneak her brother into her bedchamber in a crowded palace while sick and under constant surveillance is a physical impossibility. George's defense at his trial alluded to these discrepancies. He knew the dates didn't match. He knew he wasn't there. But in a court of treason, an alibi was irrelevant if the king wished you dead. The jury was not asked to weigh the facts. They were asked to ratify the king's will. While Jane Rochford gets the blame for betraying George, modern research suggests another woman may have played an equally lethal role, Elizabeth Brown, Countess of Worcester. Lady Worcester was one of Anne's closest ladies-in-waiting. She was the one who scrubbed the queen's back, slept at the foot of her bed, and held her secrets. According to a contemporary poem and diplomatic reports, it was Lady Worcester who first cracked under interrogation. She was likely the one who provided the circumstantial evidence that Cromwell twisted. Why? Because she was terrified. She had been caught borrowing money from the queen and hiding a pregnancy. To save herself from the king's wrath, she likely offered up the Boleyns. The tragedy of George Boleyn is that he was brought down by a whisper network he couldn't see. He was fighting a battle on the jousting field and in the council chamber, while his destruction was being plotted in the sewing circles of the queen's apartments. He underestimated the danger of the women who surrounded his sister, women who were just as desperate to survive the shark tank as he was. Why did Henry VIII believe it? This is the question that haunts the biography of George Boleyn. Henry and George were friends. They had bet on archery matches together, shared books, and traveled Europe together. How could Henry pivot from calling George my friend to believing he was sleeping with his sister? The answer lies in the psychology of the king. Henry VIII was a narcissist of the highest order. He could not accept that his marriage to Anne had failed because he was difficult or because the chemistry had faded. He needed a reason that absolved him of all blame. If Anne was a monster, a witch, an incestuous deviant, then Henry was not a failed husband. He was a victim. By believing the lie about George, Henry could rewrite history. He hadn't been wrong to leave Catherine of Aragon. He had been seduced and bewitched by the vile Boleyns. Believing in George's guilt allowed Henry to wash his hands of the blood. He could execute his friend and feel righteous about it. George Boleyn was the collateral damage of the king's fragile ego. He died because Henry needed to feel like the good guy in his own story. To find George today, you must travel to the two houses that bookended his life. Blickling Hall in Norfolk stands on the site of his birth. The current house is Jacobean, built a century after George died, but the ghost of the Boleyns hangs heavy over the land. Legend says that on the anniversary of her execution, Anne's ghost rides up the driveway holding her head. But the locals also speak of the Boleyn melancholy that permeates the place, the shadow of the family that rose too high. Hever Castle in Kent is far more personal. This was George's childhood playground. You can walk through the rooms where he learned to read, the halls where he practiced the lute. There is a specific pathos to Hever. It is a small domestic castle, a comfortable family home, not a palace. Walking its intimate corridors, you realize that before they were icons of history, George, Anne, and Mary were just children playing tag in the garden. They were a normal family that was sucked into the vortex of the crown. At Hever, you can see the book of hours that belonged to Anne. In them, she wrote messages. It is easy to imagine George sitting beside her in the window seat discussing the dangerous new ideas from Germany that would eventually kill them both. For 500 years, George Boleyn was a footnote. He was the brother. But the 21st century has been kind to him. We are currently living in the George Boleyn Renaissance. Historians like Claire Cherry and Claire Ridgway have produced detailed biographies that finally strip away the slander. Fictional portrayals have shifted too. In the BBC's Wolf Hall, George is depicted as sharp, cynical, and politically astute. In the popular The Tudor series, while historically loose, he is shown as a central, dynamic player, not just a background figure. We have finally stopped looking at him through Henry VIII's eyes. We see him now as a man of immense talent who was born into a game he couldn't win. He was the Icarus of the Tudor age. He flew on wings of gold and wax right next to the sun. And when he fell further and faster than anyone else. But as we stand at the end of this story looking back at the boy who debated scholars and the man who defied a king, we can finally give him the epitaph he deserves. He was not a traitor. He was not a monster. He was George Boleyn, and he was innocent.